On this edition of the Sky News Daily Podcast, we take a look back at some of the stories which defined 2022 and how they might shape our lives in future. Over 5 special episodes, we will be looking at politics, international affairs, the royal family, climate change, but today we are looking at, well, a turbulent year in the economy fueled by the rising price of oil and, of course, skyrocketing inflation. And as you can see, if you are watching and if you are listening, you'll hear we're joined by our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. Ed, good to see you.
You too.
It's been a year, hasn't it?
It's been a year. I mean, it's been extraordinary in kind of quite a lot of like short-term and long-term ways as well. It's kind of like hard to list all the stuff, you know, whether it was what happened in the UK with Liz Truss, what happened in Ukraine, what's happening more broadly with kind of geopolitics, you know, big questions over whether globalization is, as we know it, is going to proceed now, in China with zero COVID, and of course with energy. So, I mean, it's just genuinely hard to know where to start, really.
Well, you will get a break over Christmas, so you know. But for now, not today. Let's start though with I think one of the topics which will be forefront in people's minds right now because it is cold and people are starting to have to think about whether or not to put on the heating. The energy crisis. Can we be specific as to why we are in such dire straits when it comes to energy?
I mean, as ever, no, because there are so many like intertwining issues here. And I think that's part of the problem is, you know, when you hear government ministers come on TV, they say it to us a lot, it's all about Putin's war, Putin's illegal war. And don't get me wrong, that is a massive part of this, okay? That's part of the reason why energy prices are high. And there's a kind of conventional explanation that says you've got war in Ukraine, that's pushed up gas prices enormously. We are very reliant on gas in the UK, partly because we have the North Sea, so all of our heating systems, you know, they've got gas pumped into them. And then as a result of that, we tend to take a lot of gas mainly from Norway, actually, not much from Russia, but we're still plugged into this European kind of this European energy system. And as a result of that, anything that happens there, high prices there, shortage there, means it affects us as well. And that's, in a sense, the conventional explanation is it starts with Putin. But the interesting thing is, you know, we were talking about this this time last year or even before, gas prices were already at a record high long before this. So it's not all about that. It's also, you know, there's a big build-up of kind of pressures which have contributed to this as well. So blaming it just all on that war is kind of a bit straightforward.
So why then was there this historical kind of increase in the cost?
I mean, and this is, I think, where it gets really interesting. There's been quite a long-term underinvestment in our gas capacity, and I say I mean, you know, around the world. Oil and gas companies, they just haven't been kind of exploring as much, they haven't been kind of pumping, getting new fields as much. And as a result of that, even before the invasion of Ukraine, you were seeing this kind of this disparity between supply and demand that meant prices were going up. And then obviously Putin goes right into the middle of that at the worst possible time and has massively exploded it. But as I say, it's not just one thing, it's a whole series of things. It's kind of concatenation of different consequences. But all of it feeds into our lives. And that's been one of the most kind of heartrending and disturbing stories. And what's disturbing, like from my perspective, is we saw this coming quite a long time ago. As I say, you know, like more than a year ago, we were talking about high energy prices.
Even before that, weren't we talking about the lack of, you know, what's known as energy security in the UK? That we were in a really risky. I remember, you know, a strategic defence review talking about just how precarious our energy security was.
Yeah, and it has been for quite a long time. And in some senses, the UK is better placed than many parts of Europe because we have our own, you know, gas in the North Sea. It's obviously dwindling at the moment, and it is not enough to provide us. And that's one thing that's worth underlining. You know, even if we went out there and pumped as much as we possibly could, we still wouldn't have enough gas, you know, even with the most optimistic assumptions, to supply our massive demand. But then by the same token, you know, we are going through this extraordinary transition at the moment where we're trying to go, you know, more renewables. That is fantastic in many senses because, you know, it will be better for the environment. But on the flip side, it could be very expensive because you still need some sort of backup when the wind is not blowing and the sun's not shining. I mean, that's not kind of climate denialist point. That is just a straightforward thermodynamic engineering point. You need to provide energy for people, as we're all learning at the moment.
Something you said to me in one of our earlier podcasts, you know, an energy crisis is an everything crisis. You know, that you have high gas prices making it more expensive to heat your home. Everyone understands that, but it also plays into the cost of staples. And you used the example of tomatoes, which is an interesting one. Walk us through it.
It's an everything crisis. I mean, it's such a profound point, by the way, Neil, because, you know, I've covered economics for pretty much 2 decades now, and the shocking thing about it, when you think about it, is economics, which all of our politicians depend on it, all of the, the Chancellor, the Bank of England, everything, economics gets into everything. But there's very little consideration about how much energy matters. But then when you kind of take a step back and think about the different parts of our lives and the way that they are, fueled by energy. So tomatoes, I love it as an example, because when you look at a cherry tomato, you don't think fossil fuel product.
No.
It is a fossil fuel product. In some senses, quite literally. You need fertilizer to help it to grow. Those fertilizers are made from natural gas. You use methane to get the hydrogen, which in turn gets the nitrogen from the air through the Haber-Bosch process. It's natural gas within the fertilizer, or at least molecules that were once natural gas. You need gas in most of these greenhouses, because most of the tomatoes that we eat in the UK, certainly in the summer, are grown in greenhouses. And
polytunnel type thing.
Polytunnels in Spain, but in the UK mostly it's kind of enclosed greenhouses.
Thank you for correcting me, yes.
You were saying earlier, don't go in too deep into any kind of wormholes, but there is a tomato wormhole. So the greenhouse is heated by gas, okay? So you need gas. And then the final thing is you take the kind of extra CO2 that's pumping out of those gas boilers, and then you divert that into the greenhouse. It increases the amount of CO2 in the greenhouse from the ambient rate in the atmosphere, which is kind of 400-500 ppm, to about 800 ppm. And more CO2 means the tomatoes grow much more quickly. And you see what I mean? All of these different things, those are all quite divergent ways that we're reliant on fossil fuels, but put them all together, and you can't just easily take the fossil fuels out. When you eat a tomato, you are eating something which is quite literally, molecules of it come from fossil fuels, and it was heated, it was grown thanks to fossil fuels. There will be a way of doing it without that, but for the time being, that's a big part of our lives.
Can we just take it back, though, to the most pressing concern? We're in winter, and there are genuinely people in this country making decisions about whether to eat or whether to heat their home. If people cannot afford to heat their homes, I mean, and people earning decent enough salaries, there is something fundamentally wrong with the way things are run. I mean, is there an alternative?
Well, I think, think about what are the kind of the hierarchy of needs. There's this idea, kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and somewhere at the bottom are kind of shelter, heat, and food. Well, shelter, that's again an issue, that there is a kind of growing ranks of the homeless in this country. But heating, we've never really had to contend with anything like this in terms of the increase, the amount of our everyday spending that has had to be given over to heating. And that's something, again, that we've tried to reflect in our coverage over the years, showing kind of charts of this. And as I say, that was the scary thing for me. We were doing these charts back in, I think, at the start of the year, saying, with gas prices where they are at the moment, even before that invasion, here's what chunk it takes out of your spending. And that chunk has kind of got bigger and bigger. And the upshot being that, yeah, it is terrifying. It's been absolutely terrifying. And the government has intervened. The other thing, though, just to mention, we're talking about tomatoes. Well, because they are fossil fuel products as well, because they're made from gas, those prices have gone up as well. So if you're kind of looking at your spending and wondering, why are food prices so high? It's part of the same thing. This is why an energy crisis is an everything crisis, because it pushes up the cost of absolutely everything, because every form of economic activity is a form of energy transmission, transfer. You're turning energy, whether it's physical energy or whether it's kind of, the energy that's going into your kind of transport system or into your computers, you're turning that into economic output. And so as a result, we are all worse off because the cost of that energy has gone up. And sorry, to go back to your kind of initial question, I kind of wonder, and this is like an idle thought at times like this, what is the government for? Well, to some extent, I think the government is for trying to help ensure that we all have, an ability to have the standard of living that we would all like. And if energy prices suddenly go up from a kind of, relatively low level to an unaffordable level, then it's certainly the government's role to try to kind of ensure that people are able to deal with that, because it's so pervasive. And that is what they've done, but there's a question mark as to whether that's something that they should be doing permanently. I don't know.
Here's the thing, Ed. I mean, right now, it isn't just the cost of energy that is going up. It is genuinely the cost of pretty much everything. Just explain it, because it cannot simply be down to inflation.
No, well, I mean, it's so partly you've got this energy story, and partly you've got the world kind of rebounding after COVID-19.
That's it. Yes.
And so as a result of that, we've seen, and it preceded this latest crisis, but it's blended into it. You've seen the prices of things like well, semiconductors going up. So computer chips was a massive issue at the start of the year. And the interesting thing with all these kind of supply shocks is you have a massive shortage, and we had that shortage kind of, about a year ago. And that's meant that it's been very difficult to buy cars or buy consoles for Christmas presents. PlayStation 5s and things are still quite short in supply. But then the market responds, and you've had all these companies kind of like suddenly churning out loads more chips, and now we've got a kind of potential semiconductor glut. And so the prices of those things is kind of going down. And it's wonderful because the market is actually responding. But there is a kind of a bigger, more secular wave. So when I say secular, I mean kind of like running over many years. And that is that if we are going to achieve all of the kind of big, grand net zero goals that the government and this government and other governments have, then you need an enormous amount of kind of building, construction, mining, all of the lot.
And it's not nice. You've seen.
It's mining is a pretty brutal activity. You need to kind of explode enormous chunks out of the ground and kind of grind them up, and then blend them in acid and do all of these other things.
Simply put, you're not desperately in the pursuit of the greatest environmental goal, net zero. We are indulging in some fairly environmentally unfriendly practices.
It is, yeah. Mining and kind of whether it's lithium extraction, so lithium being one of the most important chemicals that we put into batteries, or copper, and people kind of understate the extent to which copper is so important for everything. The reason you're able to listen to this podcast is because of copper. The reason that we all have electricity is because of copper. Probably the single biggest economic leap that the world has had, save for maybe the moment where we all kind of worked out how to do agriculture, was when electricity came along and suddenly changed everyone's lives in this way that, again, it's difficult to get your head around. So we need to get maybe double the amount of copper that we currently are getting out of the ground every year into the future, just to satisfy the need for more wind turbines, for more electrification, for more electric cars. Now, the kind of upshot of all of this is that's how we get to net zero. And there is a kind of, there is a dirtiness to getting there. But the point is, when you look beyond that dirtiness, then you kind of have a future where you're not emitting as much carbon, and that's a good thing. But I think what people have kind of not really quite kind of taken account of is the fact that there's a kind of hump before we get to the kind of net zero of needing to do an extraordinary amount of exploitation, not necessarily fossil fuels. And the good news is with this copper you're getting out of the ground, you're building stuff with it rather than burning it, which is what you do with oil and coal at the moment, and you can recycle a lot of it. However, you just need so much more of it now. And I went to Chile, where they have the world's biggest copper mines, they have the world's biggest reserves of lithium as well, and seeing this stuff in person, it is enormous. It is just enormous, the scale of these lithium ponds that they're kind of extracting lithium from. The depth of this mine that I went to, it's a place called Chuquicamata in Chile, it is mind-blowing. And because it's out of sight, way off in the Chilean desert, you don't really think about it that much. But golly, I mean, we need multiples more of these massive holes in the ground if we're going to get to net zero. And a final thought on that. Funnily enough, the grades of copper you get, okay, here's a way of thinking about it. The grades of copper you get in Chile are not dissimilar, actually a little bit worse than some of the grades that are still in the ground in Cornwall. Okay? So, technically speaking, if we wanted to be self-sufficient in copper, we could go and blast massive holes in the ground.
In Cornwall?
In Cornwall.
Is that likely?
Well, I mean, ask people with holiday homes down in Cornwall. But that's the point. That is the issue we're wrestling with now. It's dirty, and it involves a lot of kind of planning constraints to get this stuff out of the ground.
I think the residents of Cornwall might need a deep breath. I think you should take a deep breath as well, because after the break we will be talking mortgages. See you in a sec. Welcome back to this special edition of the Sky News Daily Podcast. Our data and economics editor, Ed Conway, is still here. And, I warned people to perhaps have a deep breath before listening to this part of the podcast. Mortgages. I mean, it is grim out there at the moment, isn't it?
If you have a mortgage.
Yeah. Of course, and we'll talk about those that can't get one in a second.
Well, exactly. But it's this has been one of the big misconceptions that we've had to kind of wrestle with this year, is that a lot of people were kind of blithely thinking. So we started the year with interest rates kind of at 0.25%. So the Bank of England just raised them from 0.1%.
Remember those heady days.
Yeah, and they're at 0.25%. And back then, a lot of, when you looked at the market expectations, so out there in the money markets, even, right now, there are people kind of constantly betting on what the interest rates are likely to be in the future, okay? So you get these money markets which are kind of looking, and you can look through that and kind of draw up a line of where they expect rates to go. And that's kind of what your mortgage, your fixed rate mortgage, if you're refixing, is based off. Those rates, kind of swap rates, go up in a certain line. At the start of the year, or early on in the year, people thought maybe interest rates would get up to maybe 1.5%, the Bank of England interest rate. Then you obviously had the Tory leadership campaign, you had the war in Ukraine, you had a lot of kind of exogenous factors, as economists would call them, stuff happening elsewhere, but also kind of endogenous issues within the UK, so our own political problems.
Yeah, Kwasi Kwarteng had a hand in it, didn't he?
So Kwasi was a big part of it. But also, even in the run-up to Liz Truss's election as Prime Minister, you could see those rates going up because people were saying, well, inflation's high, but also this government was going to spend more. And when they're going to spend more, we're going to kind of increase those expectations. So then Kwasi Kwarteng comes in, then you have the catastrophic mini budget. Those rates, so the expected rates for mortgages, you're up from, at that point, maybe 4.5% to 6.34% for interest rates next year. And this is where I think one of those misconceptions come in. A lot of people looked at that.
And remembered the 70s.
And they remember the 70s and they remember the 80s when it went up to double-digit levels, and it's like, well, I lived through that. Why is everyone complaining?
So why have they got that so badly wrong? What is the misconception? Because again, I've had people approach me in the street saying, that, people these days don't know what, so don't know they're born. I had to deal with 13, 14, 15%.
Yeah, they're snowflakes, aren't they? So, but the reality is, it is true. Rates up at 6% are lower than they were back in the kind of the 80s and the 70s. However, the amount of debt that the average mortgage holder has is also much higher. So if you think about an interest rate, 5% of a big amount is potentially even bigger than 10% of a relatively small amount. So there's that. The amount of debt that we've got is larger. The size of our incomes relative to our mortgages is also not as high as it was back in the 70s and the 80s because we're not getting kind of well off at the same rate. And so that key thing is our ability to service the debt, okay? Yeah. That is where we run into potentially people going into kind of negative equity, facing major problems about servicing their mortgages. And the issue is that at 6%, we are hitting the same kind of levels for people getting new mortgages than you were back in 1989, 90, the very worst point in British history for mortgage pain. But here's the issue though, Neil. Back then, I think more people had mortgages. Right now, actually, there's fewer people with mortgages, partly because you've got a lot of people, generally kind of older, better off people, who've already paid off their mortgage. And so the degree of pain, this is the interesting thing. When you ask the Bank of England about this, they're like, well, yeah, it'd be awful. Be really awful for those people who do have mortgages, younger people mostly, really kind of hard pressed. But for the economy as a whole, maybe it would be okay. And they have to look at the economy as a whole. So that's what I think is going to be interesting. And I say interesting, unfortunately, in italics, because it's, possibly quite scary, yeah.
Just a word then. I mean, are we now going to see a generation? I mean, I'm lucky enough to have a mortgage, and it's been a pain over the years, don't get me wrong, but I'm very, very lucky to have had it, and I couldn't have got it without some help from my mum and dad. That is not available to many, many people these days. Are we basically seeing a generation that will be unable to get a property, get a foot on the property ladder? I mean, if they're renting at the moment, dear goodness, that in and of itself is incredibly expensive.
I think we're already in that. I think we've been in that for a while. I think there's a kind of, apartheid between people who are able to and who aren't able to get hold of the financing for mortgages, of the deposits for mortgages as well. And that is, it's so troubling, but it's not a new issue. And I think this exacerbates it. But unfortunately, we've had this for a long time, and I don't know if there's any kind of particularly straightforward explanation, kind of resolutions to it.
Build houses?
Well, build houses is part of it, but actually there are parts of it that the build houses one is part of it. But a few years ago, we made a piece which pointed out that when you talk about the housing crisis, actually there's various different housing crises in the UK. There's parts of the country where definitely more houses would be helpful, but there's also parts of the country where there's too many houses and they're actually pulling houses down, you know? Actually parts of Scotland and some parts of the northeast as well. And so there's no straightforward kind of solution to this. And the upshot, and the problem is that, you know, if you're renting at the moment as well, sorry to just add some extra kind of bad news, but if you're renting right now, rents are going up really fast as well. The difficulty is it's a distributional thing. A lot of people have done very, very well out of housing over the course of the last 2 decades or even longer, very well indeed. And they've paid off their mortgages and they've had a net increase in their wealth. And younger people just haven't been able to kind of get on that kind of ladder and on that roller coaster as easily. It's
terrible, isn't it? And you really do feel for them. I do want you to cast your eye, you know, away from 2022 and into 2023. And I'm not asking you to promise me that things are definitely going to get better, but if you could gently suggest that's the case, I'd really appreciate it.
They will get better. I mean, but they will get better in as much as we've possibly passed the peak for inflation, okay? And we've probably passed the peak of the Bank of England's, the rate at which they're increasing interest rates, okay? So they've slowed down the rate at which they're increasing interest rates. And as inflation starts to go down, then people might, you know, should hopefully feel a bit better off. The recession might not necessarily be all that deep. The concern, though, is just that although it's not a kind of especially deep recession, it's very felt in particular households' pockets. And we're all feeling it in terms of the energy squeeze. Yeah. But these things, you know, it's not grim forever. And, you know, there is an enormous opportunity here where the world is going to be potentially building all these new technologies. You know, we've heard recently about nuclear fusion. We've heard about all of these different ways that we are kind of making the world a better, cleaner, faster place. But that takes some work. And so it takes a lot of building and it takes a lot of kind of mining to get there.
Ed, do you know what? We'll leave it there before you depress me any further. Ed Conway, cracking stuff as always. And of course, a number of the topics that Ed and I have been discussing, we've covered in far greater depth on other episodes of the Sky News Daily. You can find those where you found this one. And you can also listen to our other reviews of the year. Everything from politics, of course, to the royal family, wherever you're listening to this. Ed, everyone else, thanks very much for being with us.